Through the soaring arches of Charleston's Magistrates' Hall, shafts of golden light illuminate a courtroom primed for ritual until a white uniformed sergeant intercepts its gravity with raw violence. In the hush, Sergeant Daniel Barrett's palm snaps across the cheek of Judge Aisha Randolph, its impact echoing like a gunshot. The judge's silk robe ripples as she instinctively holds her hand to her face, crimson blooming at the contact point. Gasps ricochet off marble walls, pens freeze mid-note, cameras tilt away in shock. This is more than a courtroom breach. It's a searing flashpoint of racial contempt laid bare in institutional form. What happens next will shake Charleston to its core and redefine justice's reach. It's a moment built on prejudice. It's a moment that demands your voice. If this scene unsettles you, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe now, and hit the bell so you don't miss any chapter of this unfolding saga. The courtroom, once a temple of measured civility, erupts into frozen tableau. Randolph's vision narrows to the red imprint blooming on her cheek, every heartbeat a pulse of indignation. High-pitched whispers curl through the benches. Reporters swivel lenses back toward the bench as though the cameras themselves have been slapped. A single droplet of coffee trembles on an attorney's table, then settles in silence. In that breathless stillness, Aisha Randolph confronts the raw mechanics of racism, its sudden cruelty, its entitlement to disregard a black woman's dignity. She steadies herself on the polished oak railing. At 62, she has faced contempt cloaked in civility. Microaggressions slipped into polite smiles, accusations of overreaction, whispers that her presence is an anomaly. But never this an unprovoked open-hand strike meant to demean. Her 3 decades in the law have honed her instincts sharper than any gavel. As air fills her lungs, she recalls a lifetime of clients whose voices were muted, whose wounds were minimized. In this moment, she is no longer a participant, she is the instrument of reckoning. Across the room, Barrett's smirk fractures into disbelief. His perfectly starched badge wobbles as he shifts weight brow, furrowing. He watches her still unrobed, unannounced, yet undeniably the arbiter of every person's fate here. Around him, colleagues stiffen, the bailiff's posture cracks at the heels. Prosecutors glance at one another, sensing that the rules they took for granted are unraveling. Even the clerk's trembling fingers pause over the docket. In these suspended seconds, the myth of universal respect for authority shatters against the jagged edges of racial power. From her vantage, Randolph observes each reaction with clinical precision. She notes the flicker of fear in Barrett's eyes, the hurried exchange of glances among seasoned officers. She senses the journalist's electric anticipation. This is not a perfunctory hearing anymore. It is the first chapter of history in motion. Her reflection curls around her thoughts. Justice was never meant to be a shield only for the powerful. It must roar on behalf of the silenced, the ignored, the battered. Then, with a fluid grace that defies her rippling pain, she steps forward. Her heels click a deliberate countdown across the marble. Light fractures on her steel-rimmed glasses, and for a moment the distant hum of the fluorescent fixtures sinks with her steady breath. The gallery leans in, drawn toward the low-key authority pulsing from her unadorned stance. She is unrobed but not unarmed. Her conviction and the law are her armor. As she reaches the bench, time loosens its hold. The gavels and whispers fade into the background. The only clarity is her purpose. The silent chant of precedent and protocol rushes through her mind, Title 16, Chapter 3, Section 1. Criminal assault on a public official. The words taste like thunder on her tongue. She lifts her gaze to Barrett, whose chest tightens in sudden comprehension. In the hush before her voice, the courtroom air is taut as a drawn bow. Randolph's lips part, not with anger, but with unwavering resolve. Each syllable she will speak is charged with decades of unspoken grievances, of injustices too long tolerated. Behind her, the murals of Lady Justice, blindfolded, balanced scales held aloft, seem to lean forward, bearing witness. Then the calm, cold question rings out, cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Sergeant Barrett," she says, voice unwavering, "did you just strike me in this courtroom?" Judge Randolph's cheek throbbed with a pulse that was both physical and symbolic. In that searing instant, as Barrett's palm settled warm against her skin, she felt something awaken, a flash of memory from decades past, When her young client sat shackled before her, their futures quietly folded away because of who they were and where they came from. She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, recalling a 19-year-old with bruises on his wrists, his terrified eyes brimming with questions she could barely answer. It was then she vowed that no abuse of authority would pass unchallenged on her watch. She opened her eyes to Barrett's rigid silhouette framed against the courtroom's high windows. The sunlight, once golden, now felt harsh, accusatory. At 62, her silver hair was more than a sign of years. It was a banner of every trial she'd fought, every injustice she'd corrected, every colleague who'd underestimated her because of her gender, because of her race. When she first stepped into the dim corridors of the public defender's office, the voice on the other end of the intercom called her sweetheart. She answered every whispered slight with meticulous motion poring over case law until the edges of statute grew soft under her scrutiny, building a reputation as the woman who could find a crack in any prosecutor's argument. Later, when she crossed to the prosecutor's side, she carried that same fire. She confronted judges who'd casually dismissed complaints of police brutality, demanding to know why a blood-stained shirt wasn't enough to merit an investigation. She sat across from sheriffs who'd sworn at her in the hallways, meeting their foul-mouthed contempt with questions that left them speechless. But nothing had prepared her for Barrett's deliberate slap, the raw embodiment of unchecked power striking its most vulnerable target. A hush fell over the courtroom as Randolph drew herself upright. Behind her, the bailiff stood motionless, his hand inches from the handcuffs at his belt. Journalists exchanged hurried glances, sensing the gravity of what was unfolding. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath, and then she spoke, voice measured but carrying the weight of her entire life's work. "Sergeant Barrett," she said, "did you just strike me in this courtroom?" His answer came out in a stammered denial, a string of excuses about mistaken identity and lack of respect. But Randolph's instincts, refined by 30 years of advocacy, cut through his lies like a knife through silk. She listened to the tremor in his voice, to the frantic flicker of shame across his face. She watched the way his fellow officers averted their gaze as though the very air around them had turned toxic. She could almost taste the history embedded in these moments, the countless times that officers had brushed aside complaints from black citizens, the labored bureaucratic dance that buried evidence the size of exasperation when families dared to ask for accountability. Barrett's slap was not an isolated act of cruelty. It was a symptom of a larger disease, one that thrived on silence and shadows. And in that dread-filled courtroom, she chose to expose it. Without a hint of hesitation, Randolph began to invoke the law. She stepped off the bench and approached the clerk's desk, her heels clicking against the marble like a metronome counting down to justice. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed as though in sympathetic resonance with her resolve. Randolph read the statute aloud. Title 16, Chapter 3, Section 1, Criminal Assault of a Public Official. She declared that a formal investigation would commence immediately, that Barrett would be detained, and that no amount of rank or institutional pressure would shield him this time. Shock rippled through the room. Barrett's mouth hung open as if tasting the fresh air of possibility for the first time. Prosecutors swallowed hard, defense attorneys straightened their ties. A single cell phone camera tilted back toward the bench, red record light glaring as though bearing witness to history. Randolph sensed the shift. What began as a routine arraignment had become the crucible in which Charleston's conception of justice would be tested. Her mind flickered back to the spotlighted courtroom where she'd once defended a teenager accused of vandalism. The boy's hands had been trembling so badly that he could barely sign his name, his future balanced on the mercy of the bench. She had seen in his eyes the stark terror of a system that valued control over compassion. Now that same system manifested in Barrett's arrogance, his misplaced brutality in service of some twisted notion of respect. But Randolph refused to let another life be collateral damage. She instructed the bailiff to place Barrett under temporary detainment. She rescheduled the day's proceedings for the following morning. Then, with the same calm efficiency she used to marshal witnesses in high-profile police misconduct trials, she ordered the courtroom locked. No union representatives, no external fixers, no backroom deals. Everyone in that chamber was now a witness to truth. As officers guided Barrett from the room, blood drained from his face. Randolph watched them go, her shoulders straight, her jaw set. There was no vindictive glee in her stance. There was only the stillness of someone who had glimpsed the core of systemic injustice and chose to confront it head-on. She returned to her chambers with the solemnity of a general surveying the aftermath of battle, which in her mind this most certainly was. Within minutes, she summoned 2 investigators from Internal Affairs Agent Simone Carter, whose steely competence was legendary, and Agent Diego Morales, whose sharp intellect had cracked numerous cold cases. Randolph laid out the blueprint: collect every complaint against Barrett, locate missing body cam footage, subpoena administrative emails, and trace any suspicious financial transactions connected to his defense. No stone would remain unturned, no protocol would be bent. Her voice remained low, but the fire under it was unmistakable. They poured over her desk stacks of red-flagged folders, detailed notes from past hearings, lists of attorneys known to handle police misconduct cases. Carter tapped a finger on a sealed envelope marked 2019, missing video. Morales nodded toward a ledger showing donations from the Police Benevolent Fund. Randolph's heart pounded. The pieces were there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone with the will to piece them together. This was her moment of reckoning, but even as her inner circle mobilized, Randolph remained acutely aware of the broader canvas. She thought of the community outside families who'd marched with handmade signs, clergy, who'd snapped photos of bruised protesters' parents, who whispered bedtime warnings to their children about encounters with police. They looked to her not just as a judge in a castle of cold stone, but as a steward of hope, a guardian who could wield law as a beacon instead of a cudgel. Her reflection flickered on the window pane. In her eyes, she saw more than the stern gaze of a jurist. She saw the resolve of someone who had weathered storms of bias and emerged unbowed. She remembered the countless afternoons spent poring over case files long after the courthouse emptied, searching for patterns for human stories buried beneath legal jargon. She remembered the late nights mentoring young lawyers, urging them to question the status quo, to push against the inertia of institutional complacency. Now, as the agents filed out with evidence requests and subpoenas, Randolph allowed herself a fleeting moment of vulnerability. She touched the faint red mark on her cheek, the physical burn of Barrett's ignorance. It would fade, but it would never disappear from her memory. More importantly, it would stand as a symbol proof that neglecting accountability could leave even the most decorated officers exposed, that power without principle was brittle. She straightened her shoulders and squared her gaze at the array of case files stacked before her. Tomorrow she would open court with a rescheduled docket, but these were not the only cases she intended to hear. The rot she had sensed in Barrett's actions extended into every corner of the institution. She resolved to shine a light so bright that no corner of corruption could remain hidden. In that commitment lay a promise for the next generation: the scales of justice would tilt toward transparency. As evening shadows crept up her chamber's walls, Randolph settled into the leather chair behind her desk. The courthouse's marble halls were dark now, but her mind blazed with possibilities. In the quiet, she whispered to herself the oath she had taken so many years ago: to uphold the law, to protect the innocent, and to challenge oppression wherever it appeared. The slap had ignited a reckoning. Now it was her charge to see it through. Outside, the city slept under a blanket of history and tension. Inside, Judge Aisha Randolph sat prepared to lead Charleston into its most consequential trial, not just of one man's violence, but of an entire system's conscience. And in the gathering darkness, the promise of dawn felt closer than ever. Barrett's palms sweat as he's guided from the courtroom, every step imprinting the weight of his actions onto the polished marble. He presses his back against the cold wall of the holding room, adrenaline still crackling through his veins. Moments ago, he believed himself untouchable, decades of complaints filed against him, each one fading into a bureaucratic abyss, had built an invisible fortress around his badge. But now that fortress feels brittle. In his office hours earlier, Barrett had scrolled past yet another internal memo about a civilian's unfounded complaint. He'd tossed it into the circular shred bin without a second thought. Harassment allegations, excessive force. Each report was a grain of sand in a cupboard of swept-away testimonies. They never saw the light of day because he had allies, fellow officers, who vouched for his character, prosecutors, who labeled the complaints inconclusive, and department heads eager to avoid scandal. His smirking confidence was born from knowing the system would protect him. But when his hand struck Aisha Randolph's cheek, When he realized that the woman he'd thought a lowly clerk was the presiding judge, the veneer of invincibility cracked. That realization had pierced him like a bullet. And as the bailiff's hand hovered over the cuffs at his belt thumb, half raised in hesitation, Barrett felt the first whisper of dread. He'd broken the unspoken code no one assaulted a judge and walked away unscathed. Now alone in the half-lit holding cell, he paces in tight circles. The concrete bench and steel door close in around him. He hears the faint hum of fluorescent lights above their buzz, a taunting echo of the courtroom silence he shattered. He stops mid-step and presses his forehead against the wall, seeking calm in the rough texture. He can't escape the memory of Randolph's calm, surgical calm. The courtroom had stopped. The world had watched. And now outside those hallowed walls, whispers of his downfall spread like wildfire. He recalls the litany of his past, the teenager who said he feared choking to death in a chokehold, the community activist whose protest was met with truncheons, the man who emerged from the precinct with a fractured rib, yet no charges were ever filed. He'd worn his uniform like armor, believing he was righteous in every tangle with disorder. But the records told another story, one of convenience, where evidence files went missing, where video footage malfunctioned, where paperwork bore signs of late-night edits. He had seen it happen to other officers, and perhaps he had even whispered gratitude for the system's discretion. His mind drifts to ADA Elena Brooks, the prosecutor who sat almost too eagerly at his side in dozens of cases. He'd noticed how she lingered after hearings, offering him congratulatory nods that felt more like transactions. She never questioned his tactics. She never hesitated to drop charges that might leave him vulnerable. That partnership had cemented his reputation as an unassailable lawman. Together, they had formed a silent pact. He wielded force on the street. She wielded discretion in the courtroom. In return, they upheld each other's power. Barrett exhales slowly, trying to steady his racing heart. He knows his name reverberates through the courthouse corridors, now tainted by the crack of his palm. Rumors swirl. Barrett slapped the judge. His colleagues in the precinct will learn soon. The union rep will call. They'll offer legal counsel assurances that this can be smoothed over behind closed doors. But Randolph's commanding declaration of a criminal investigation, her refusal to let the incident slide, means this is no longer a procedural hiccup. This is a reckoning. He presses a hand against his chest as though trying to calm the erratic thud of his heartbeat. Memories flash of former partners patting him on the back after a rough arrest of precinct parties, where he raised a toast to keeping the streets safe of headlines praising the vigilant sergeant. He had believed these honors were earned through service. Now he wonders how many were bought with silence and compromised justice. The door to the holding cell clicks. An officer appears stern, businesslike. "Sergeant Barrett," she says, voice curt. "You have a visitor." A flicker of hope ignites in his chest, the union rep. But when he steps into the hallway, he sees not a lawyer but internal affairs agent Simone Carter and her partner Diego Morales' faces he recognizes from precinct whispers as the duo who handle sensitive investigations. Their expressions are unreadable. Carter holds a folder. "Sergeant," she begins evenly, "we need your statement about today's events." Barrett's throat dries. A statement already. He opens his mouth, searching for a carefully crafted denial, but the words stick. His breath catches as Carter's gaze pins him. Morales steps forward, unrolling photographs of the courtroom. Barrett's hand mid-air, Randolph's stunned expression, the clutch of onlookers frozen in horror. He glances down. Every legal maneuver he'd relied upon, suppressed bribes, missing footage, friendly prosecutors, means nothing now in the glaring clarity of photographic evidence. The images bear no context for good policing. They reveal only the moment a man overstepped, hurting a woman whose title and humanity he failed to recognize. He swallows the lump in his throat, the bitter taste of humiliation rising. Carter lays the photos on a small metal table. "We'll need any documents, emails, or recordings you've reviewed concerning Judge Randolph's arraignment this morning," she says. Morales adds, "and any communications with ADA Brooks regarding case dismissals tied to your conduct." Barrett's mind reels. These details had once floated innocuously through his daily routine. Now they are evidence in a criminal investigation. She watches him closely as he nods. She's not sympathetic, She's thorough. In her eyes, he is not a white uniform shrouded in privilege, but a man whose actions carry consequences. He follows her back to the interrogation room, the same one where he once sat to question suspects, now repurposed to question him. As the door shuts behind him, Barrett feels the walls close in tighter. He sees the faint reflection of his uniform in the mirrored glass, the badge pinned over his heart, and wonders if it has become a target rather than a shield. He thinks of his family of the pergola in his backyard of the sunlit afternoons he never suspected could end in disgrace. He wonders what his colleagues will say behind his back, what the public will think how quickly a man's reputation can crumble. He straightens in the chair, trying to shed the image of a cornered animal. "I want my lawyer," he says, voice hushed but firm. Carter nods without comment. Morales slides a pen and a blank statement form across the table. Barrett picks up the pen. His hand trembles. He stares at the paper, the words Sergeant Daniel Barrett typed at the top. He is accustomed to writing reports that justify his actions. Now he must write one that could condemn him. He lifts the pen, marking the first few shaky words. Each sentence threatens to unspool a lifetime of half-truths and omissions. "I did not intend to harm Judge Randolph. I did not recognize her authority. I meant only to restore order." But as he writes, he hears her voice echoing in his mind, calm, precise, unyielding. He realizes that this statement is more than a recounting of events. It is a confession of how deeply ingrained his sense of entitlement had become. Outside in the corridors of the courthouse, the city hums with anticipation. Journalists cluster around the entrance, their whispers weaving narratives that will flood every news outlet by noon. Community activists prepare statements anticipating the outrage that will follow. And in chambers above, Judge Randolph convenes with Internal Affairs, plotting the next phase of her investigation. Barrett finishes the final line of his statement, laying down the pen with a soft click. He looks up at Carter. That's all he says. His voice carries no defiance, only a hollow resignation. She collects the form, placing it carefully in her folder. Morales removes the photos from the table, tucking them under his arm. As they escort him back to the holding cell, Barrett's mind churns. He understands now that his world of procedural voids is collapsing. Each complaint, each suppressed recording, each dismissed case is a brick in the dam holding back his reckoning. And that dam has burst. In that moment, Barrett glimpses the true enormity of what he's done. He hears the distant echo of Randolph's gavel striking the bench, not as a token of ceremony, but as a call to justice. And as the steel door of the cell closes behind him, he realizes the hard truth: in a world where power once sheltered him, only accountability remains. Randolph's steps across the polished marble resonated through the hushed courtroom, each footfall a deliberate assertion of authority. She had shed the ritual weight of her black robe, standing bareheaded in her tailored charcoal slacks and soft loafers, as though to remind everyone that justice lives beyond symbols. Overhead, the fluorescent tubes hummed like an expectant audience, their cool glare revealing every quiver in Barrett's stance. His eyes darted from her face to the bailiff's belt, where handcuffs waited like dormant verdicts. The gallery held its breath. Reporters hovered over laptops, their fingertips pausing mid-keystroke as the narrative they thought they understood warped in real time. Attorneys leaned toward one another, mouths agape, exchanging glances heavy with disbelief. Even Marcus Jones, the bailiff whose steady presence had once been the quiet backbone of order, stepped forward, unholstering the clamps that would enforce Randolph's decree. Jones's jaw tightened, the uniform respect in his posture rippling with the realization that today the judge had become the centerpiece of a seismic shift. Randolph's gaze locked on Barrett, unwavering and luminous with controlled intensity. The sheen of sweat on his brow caught the cold light, a silent admission of the vulnerability he'd only just discovered. She allowed a pause to stretch between them, long enough for the distant echo of gavels passed to resonate in her ears, long enough for every witness to feel the tension coil in their chests. Then she spoke, her voice a calm gale. "Did you just assault me, Sergeant Barrett?" The words landed with the weight of a thunderclap. They reverberated off the columns, stirring the silent spectators like an unseen wind. Barrett's mouth snapped shut as though the question itself had struck him. The courtroom's mechanical whir of pens and papers resumed, but now it sounded frantic, as if the room itself were scrambling to record a moment destined for history. Barrett swallowed his Adam's apple, bobbing. He opened his mouth, a reflexive gesture, but no apology came. Instead, he shot a pleading glance at the clerk as though hoping for sanctuary in administrative routines. The clerk avoided his eyes, her fingers frozen above the docket. In that instant, the entire network of institutional support Barrett had counted on shimmered and dissolved, revealing the raw core of his misconduct. Randolph's lips curved in a faint, steely smile, not of triumph, but of resolute clarity. She leaned forward over the bench, the morning sun slicing through the windows, and casting prisms of color across her pens and legal pads. In that kaleidoscopic light, she embodied both the frailty and the ferocity of humanity under the law. Every muscle in her frame transmitted the singular message that no authority, no matter how long-standing or shielded, could escape accountability. She drew in a measured breath and continued in the same even tone that judges use to temper life and death decisions. "Sergeant Barrett, please stand. You are formally under criminal investigation for assault on a public official. Bailiff Jones, detain him immediately for his protection and the integrity of these proceedings." Her words fell like gavel strikes, each one definitive and irreversible. Marcus Jones stepped forward with seamless professionalism, clicking the cuffs over Barrett's wrists with a precision that echoed years of disciplined protocol. Barrett's shoulders slumped as the cold steel closed around him. He opened his mouth again, but the only sound was the rasp of the cuffs sliding shut. Randolph watched him carefully, allowing the visible weight of the handcuffs to sink in. She knew from history how power could obscure compassion. Today, she wielded power to affirm it. Because of this incident, today's arraignment is postponed, she announced, turning to the clerk, as though the disruption were a simple schedule change. But everyone knew this was anything but routine. The murmurs rippled through the press gallery, emails hurriedly opened, cameras adjusted. The prosecuting attorney looked ready to stand and speak, but hesitated under the gravity of Randolph's command. Then Randolph's voice softened, not in concession, but in invitation. "Members of the gallery, your presence here is recorded. Every statement, every photograph, every journalist's name will be part of the public record. This courtroom belongs to the people, not to privilege." She offered a brief nod to the row of cameras that had turned back toward her, their lenses like countless witness eyes. In that gesture, she acknowledged the broader community that relies on transparency as the lifeblood of democracy. As Jones guided Barrett from the bench, Randolph briefly glanced at the teenager defendant remaining at the defense table. His eyes were wide, the heat of shame clinging to his shoulders. She caught his gaze and offered a small, reassuring lift of her eyebrow, an unspoken promise that this case too would not be buried under the rubble of institutional expediency. Even amid this turmoil, Randolph recognized her duty to those whose lives also hinged on this courtroom's integrity. Once Barrett was escorted through the swinging doors, Randolph pressed her hand flat against the bench, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her palm. She inhaled the stale scent of leather-bound law books and waxed floors memories flooding back of her first day. On the bench, nerves taut, conviction untested. Now, 3 decades later, the beam of her resolve had never been brighter. She stepped down from the bench and gathered her notes with deliberate calm. Every detail mattered: the statute she'd invoked, the exact time of the assault, the names of witnesses and journalists present. This was not a detour from justice. It was justice exemplified. Randolph moved toward her chambers, her gait steady, the distant murmur of the crowd growing faint behind each door that closed. In her private chambers, she removed her glasses and gazed at the faint red bruise blossoming on her cheek. It throbbed, a physical testament to the arrogance she had just confronted. She traced its outline with her fingertips, not in pain, but in recognition. This mark was not a scar of victimhood, but a badge of accountability. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a leather-bound notebook lined with decades of case notes. With a steady hand, she recorded the incident in exacting detail: date, time, location, participants, actions taken. This was the first entry in what would become a comprehensive dossier on Barrett's misconduct. As she wrote, her mind drifted to the wider implications. She thought of colleagues who had remained silent when faced with evidence of abuse. She thought of community members who felt rightly that the law too often served the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. She thought of her own journey from public defender to prosecutor to judge, each role shaped by the same belief that justice must be more than a perfunctory ritual. It must be a living, breathing force for change. Her reflection shifted to her team Simone Carter and Diego Morales in internal affairs, already drafting subpoenas and evidence requests. Marcus Jones, whose professionalism ensured that protocols upheld dignity even amid upheaval. The courthouse clerks who would archive every transcript for posterity. She pictured their determined faces ready to turn this moment of crisis into a catalyst for transparency. Randolph closed the notebook and placed it next to the statute volumes on her desk. She straightened the spines of the books as if aligning the scales of justice themselves. Then she leaned back in her chair, meeting her own gaze in the small round mirror taped above her nameplate. The bruise had already started to fade, but its imprint on her resolve would endure. She steepled her fingers and exhaled slowly. The courthouse walls seemed to pulse with anticipation, every corridor, every chamber, every marble step awaiting the next phase of reckoning. Randolph's final thought before she rose was not of triumph, but of responsibility. The moment she had seized was only the beginning. In the days ahead, she would ensure that no complaint, no piece of evidence, and no person be swept away again. The bench would no longer be a shield for privilege. It would be a beacon for accountability. With that, she stood, straightened her jacket, and prepared to lead Charleston into the next chapter of its own confrontation with power and prejudice. Justice, she knew, was not a single gavel strike. It was the unrelenting pursuit of truth even when it left marks on one's cheek. And today, Aisha Randolph wore her mark proudly. Sergeant Barrett's shoulders sagged as the weight of Randolph's declaration settled over him. His stammered denials earlier, laced with bravado, crumbled in the face of her unwavering gaze. The hush following her words was so absolute that every breath sounded amplified, the clerk's quiet intake of air, the soft rustle of a defense attorney's suit, the muffled click of a camera focusing. Barrett searched Randolph's face, hoping for a retreat that never came. Randolph rested her hand on the gavel. Her fingers steeled around its handle, an extension of her resolve. She drew in a deliberate breath and quoted the statute with precision. Under Title 16, Chapter 3, Section 1 of the South Carolina Code of Laws. Any person who assaults a public official in the performance of official duties is guilty of a felony punishable by imprisonment. Therefore, I hereby open a criminal investigation into Sergeant Barrett's conduct. The gavel descended with a crack that reverberated through marble columns and settled in every soul present. It was more than wood-meeting sound block. It was the final punctuation on centuries of unspoken toleration. In that instant, the courtroom shifted from a venue of rote formalities to the epicenter of a moral reckoning. Reporters straightened in their seats, scribbling frantic shorthand as though capturing a moment of prophecy. Barrett's eyes flicked to the bailiff, who nodded once and moved with crisp authority. The handcuffs that had clicked shut around Barrett's wrists earlier now felt like the first visible link in a chain of consequences. He stood rigid, breath shallow, as Jones guided him to the temporary holding area just outside the courtroom doors. Each step echoed like a drumbeat of accountability, drawing silent witnesses even from the hallway. As the door swung closed, an uneasy murmur began to swell. Attorneys exchanged hasty consultations, their private barbs now public confidences. The prosecuting attorney, traditionally a pillar of deference to judicial prerogative, hesitated before rising. She cleared her throat, voice measured as she addressed Randolph. Your Honor, the state will fully cooperate. We will prepare bond recommendations and coordinate with the solicitor's office to advance the investigation. Randolph inclined her head. Thank you. Counsel for the defense will have the opportunity to respond once the initial reports are filed. For now, this court stands in recess until tomorrow morning at 9. The clerk banged the gavel once to suspend proceedings, and the finality of the strike resonated as though dividing before and after in the courthouse's storied history. Outside the chamber, the hallway buzzed with activity. Journalists spilled notes onto phones, tapping out headlines destined for a waking world. Clerks scurried for files. Bailiffs conferred in low voices. Randolph paused by her chamber's door, watching the flurry of purpose she had ignited. The courthouse, long an emblem of solemn ritual, now pulsed with an electric hunger for justice. Back in her private chambers, Randolph removed her glasses and pinched the bridge of her nose. The aftertaste of adrenaline lingered in her veins, tempered by the gravity of what lay ahead. She reached for her leather-bound notebook, a repository of case law and personal annotations, and began mapping the next steps. Names of witnesses, timelines of events, procedural deadlines. The investigation would be surgical in its thoroughness. An echo in her mind traced back to her earliest days as a public defender defending clients whose lives hinged on nuances of procedure and precedent. She remembered the dread in a mother's voice when she explained the margin for error in police misconduct cases. Now she was on the other side of that ledger, wielding the law itself to honor the very principles she defended long ago. She summoned Agent Simone Carter and Agent Diego Morales into her office. Their entry was silent but purposeful. Both carried tablets brimming with digital evidence and preliminary witness statements. Carter spoke first, voice steady. "Judge Randolph, we've secured the courtroom surveillance footage and begun cataloging complaints lodged against Barrett dating back 7 years. Several, particularly from 2019 and 2021, have missing video segments that coincide with his most controversial arrests." Morales nodded, projecting a chart of redacted incident reports onto Randolph's desk monitor. "We've also cross-referenced financial disclosures. There's a pattern of contributions from the Police Benevolent Fund routed through third-party accounts, coinciding with Barrett's legal defense expenditures. We're tracing connections to several assistant prosecutors." Randolph leaned forward, eyes narrowing in focus. "Compile every related transaction, every communication, and demand full custodial records from the solicitor's office. Notify the Department of Justice liaison that this is moving to a joint federal-state inquiry. We will need external oversight to guarantee transparency." Carter tapped her pen. "Understood. We're already drafting subpoenas and contacting potential witnesses, fellow officers, community leaders, the teenager from the vandalism case. Everyone with first-hand knowledge." As the agents filed out, Randolph allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought of the courtroom as a crucible, once a place where ceremony and decorum masked the fissures of power. Now it would become a forge, reshaping the very definition of accountability. The law, she believed, was not a cage, but a mechanism for collective healing. Her thoughts turned briefly to Barrett himself. Behind his arrogance lay fear of exposure, fear of losing everything he'd built on a foundation of silence. Yet she did not relish his downfall. Rather, she respected the solemn duties she performed. In her mind, justice was never retribution, but restoration, a chance for an institution to reconcile its ideals with its actions. By dusk, Randolph's chambers were strewn with binders and digital drives. She drafted her official order, sealing it with the courthouse emblem and dispatching copies to the solicitor, the state attorney general, and the federal liaison. Each seal was a promise that no rank would eclipse the rule of law. No alliance would override fair process. Late that evening, as Randolph finally rose from her desk, shadows stretched across the marbled lobby below. The courthouse lights glowed like watchful sentinels. She paused at the threshold of her chambers, placing a hand on the doorframe, breathing in the weight of history and hope intertwined. In the quiet hush of empty halls, she heard the echo of her own gavel strikes, each one a testament to courage, each one a beacon for the work yet to come. Tomorrow, the world would watch. But for now, Judge Aisha Randolph stood alone in the corridors of power, unwavering in her conviction that justice, when tested, must not only speak, but roar. The fluorescent lights in Judge Randolph's chambers flickered to life like reluctant sentinels, dispelling the late afternoon gloom that clung to the marble corridors. Within an hour of Barrett's arrest, the air in her private office had shifted from quiet solemnity to the crackling energy of a command center. Stacks of case files, binders bulging with red-stamped confidential labels, and folders teetered on her battered oak desk, which now served as the fulcrum of her new investigation. Paper clips, post-it notes, and highlighter pens lay scattered across its surface, each marking a potential fracture in Barrett's carefully constructed facade. Agent Simone Carter strode in first, her posture taut with purpose. She set a silver laptop beside Randolph's leather-bound notebook and opened a folder taped shut since 2019. "This is the initial body cam inventory," she said, voice low and precise. "Watch the timestamps around disputed arrests." Randolph leaned in, her eyes narrowing as Carter clicked through dozens of file names, some labeled malfunction, others simply missing. Each missing clip was a silent witness swallowed by bureaucracy. Diego Morales arrived moments later carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee. He placed one before Randolph and the other by Carter, eyes bright with anticipation. The forensic team has keyed into the precinct's server, he reported, voice edged with excitement. We've recovered partial footage from one incident last June, but the rest are encrypted or wiped. Carter's jaw clenched as Morales continued. We've also cross-referenced internal emails. The chain of custody logs show manual overrides timed just after Barrett's shifts. Randolph pressed her fingertips together, summoning the same calm authority she exuded in the courtroom. She recalled the cramped corridors of the public defender's office where she first encountered missing evidence that doomed innocent clients. Now, decades later, she found herself fighting the same invisible battle, only this time armed with the full might of judicial oversight. She looked from Carter to Morales, a silent affirmation passing between them. They would dig until every hidden file saw daylight. Carter tapped a few keys, pulling up archived complaint forms. Here, she said, highlighting a report from 2017 filed by an off-duty nurse who witnessed Barrett use excessive force during a bar disturbance. The nurse's statement was thorough names times even a photo of bruises. Yet the case file bore a stamped note, closed. No probable cause. Carter's finger hovered over the note, an indictment of procedural erasure. They shelved this to avoid internal review, she murmured, eyes flashing. Morales swiveled his monitor to show a spreadsheet of prosecutorial dispositions. 88 Elena Brooks signed off on dismissals for 5 separate complaints between 2016 and 2020. He explained. Each dismissal weighed heavily on the screen, a simple nolle prosequi notation buried beneath layers of indifference. She cited insufficient evidence, Morales said. But with the footage wiped and witness interviews unrecorded, that was the point. The room's hush deepened as Randolph absorbed the pattern, a symbiotic alliance of force and silence. She recalled Barrett's smirk, that reflexive condescension, when he thought her a mere clerk. Now they confronted a labyrinth built on mutual convenience, officer and prosecutor, reinforcing each other's impunity. The realization stung, but she steeled herself. We need to map every case Barrett influenced, she said, and any ADA who signed off without proper review. Morales nodded, pulling a notepad from his briefcase and jotting down names and dates. Carter initiated a database merge victim statements, internal memos. Financial ledgers from the Police Benevolent Fund. Look at this, she said, shifting the screen to reveal a trail of transactions funneling from a charitable fund into private defense accounts. $500,000 over 5 years earmarked for officer assistance. But the leads point to Barrett's legal fees. Randolph felt a familiar rush, the intoxicating certainty that they were unearthing truths no amount of bureaucracy could bury. She pictured the families who had come to her chambers over the years, haunted by memories of nights their loved ones vanished into precinct cells. Now she had the opportunity to change the narrative, to bring those stories into the light. She folded her hands and blinked away the weight of the task. Simone Diego assembled these findings into a preliminary report. I want to send it to the solicitor's office by morning, and prepare subpoenas for Ada Brooks and departmental finance records. As the agents worked in tandem, Carter vetting each redacted file, Morales cross-referencing witness lists, Randolph retrieved a legal pad and began sketching a timeline. Arrest dates, complaint filings, dismissal dates, missing footage intervals. Each element was a plank in the foundation of what justice demanded. She jotted notes in the margins. Public release press conference, federal liaison. Her handwriting, neat and confident, traced the blueprint of accountability. The faint hum of the courthouse beyond her door felt distant now, replaced by the low drone of urgent activity. The oak floorboards creaked under the weight of their presence, as though the building itself recognized the significance of what unfolded within these walls. Carter exhaled heavily and pushed back from her laptop. We've located 3 additional sealed complaints, she said. One involves a civilian who recorded Barrett beating a suspect, a teenage boy, then scrawled a summary on hospital stationery. That kid is now untraceable. His family moved away. Randolph paused before responding, digesting the human cost behind each statistic. We'll need to find him, she said quietly. His testimony could be pivotal. Morales nodded and tapped a contact into his phone. I have a field agent who can track him down tonight. The room fell silent as Randolph closed her eyes briefly, picturing the young man whose life had been derailed by an assault disguised as law enforcement. She remembered another case decades ago when she had fought to reopen an old homicide file after discovering an officer had omitted exculpatory evidence. The prosecutor in that case had recused himself and the conviction had been overturned. It was a hard-won victory, proof that perseverance could redeem broken systems. Now she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This would be her legacy. As the agents resumed their work, Randolph rose and moved to the window. Beneath her, the city's courthouse steps gleamed in the waning light, a silent stage for history in motion. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, envisioning the community she served, parents waiting outside after hearing of Barrett's arrest. Activists whispering fervent hopes of reformed journalists crafting narratives that could sway public will. In that moment, Randolph understood that justice was not confined to her chambers or the bench. It thrived in collective will and communal scrutiny. She turned back to the war room of her office, where Carter had flagged a particularly damning email thread between Barrett and Brooks discussing which incidents to fast-track for closure. Morales had printed the thread out, and it lay on the desk like a smoking gun. Randolph lifted it with care, her fingers tracing the words that transformed collusion from suspicion into fact. She tucked it next to her notebook, a promise that no one would dismiss these revelations as rumors. By the time dusk fully settled over Charleston, the task force had compiled a dossier thick enough to choke a printer. Each page was a testament to meticulous work, scanned witness statements, redacted financial spreadsheets, asset forfeiture records, and a summary of missing video segments. The dossier's spine bore a single label in Randolph's precise handwriting: Operation Integrity. Barrett Investigation. She stood before the assembled files, fatigue tugging at her shoulders, yet a fierce light burned in her eyes. This was more than an investigation. It was a reckoning. The courthouse's marble walls had borne witness to countless ceremonies, but today they had absorbed the sound of justice reawakening. The rosettes on the ceiling seemed to reverberate with the echoes of every gavel strike Randolph had issued over the years, each one forging a path toward fairness. Carter and Morales exchanged a glance, an unspoken acknowledgement of what they had achieved in mere hours. Judge Randolph Carter said, voice respectful, "We have everything we need to move forward." Randolph nodded, a determined smile pulling at her lips. "Let's make sure the entire city sees what we've uncovered, and that no one can claim they didn't know." She reached for the phone to alert the solicitor's office and her federal liaison, each call a deliberate step toward comprehensive accountability. In the deepening twilight, Charleston's streets below her window were still and expectant. Inside Judge Randolph's chambers, the war room stood ready. The files lined up like soldiers in formation, everyone poised to testify against the rot of unchecked power. And at the center of it all, Aisha Randolph remained barefoot, on polished floors, her presence a quiet storm set to dismantle the shadows of privilege. With one final glance at the dossier, she closed her notebook and whispered to herself, "Justice isn't a privilege. It's a right." The morning air in Randolph's chambers felt charged, as though the walls themselves had gathered momentum from the previous night's discoveries. Simone Carter and Diego Morales were already at the desk when Randolph arrived, their faces etched with a mix of fatigue and fierce purpose. Between them lay a sheaf of court transcripts bound by paperclips alongside printed bank statements stained with highlighter marks. The station clock ticked over 8 o'clock, and the chamber's muted buzz signaled the start of another day in their unfolding probe. Morales pushed a transcript toward Randolph. "This is from the January arraignment," he said, voice low. ADA Elena Brooks signed off on dismissing Barrett's use of force charges against that suspect in July of last year. Randolph slid her fingers over the crisp pages, reading the exculpatory note, "No further action." The words leapt off the page like a betrayal inked in cold neutrality. She recalled the young man in that case, a laborer with a fractured cheekbone, who'd begged for justice only to have it stripped away with a mention of insufficient evidence. Carter tapped a series of numbers on her tablet. "Wire transfers," she announced. Bright blue lines of data mapped out connections between the Charleston Police Benevolent Fund and a private legal defense account. Between 2018 and 2023, nearly $500,000 had flowed from a fund ostensibly dedicated to community welfare into the coffers of a law firm known to represent Barrett. Half of these transfers coincided with dismissals or unfiled complaints. Carter set her tone steady, but her eyes sharp. Every time Barrett faced serious allegations, someone quietly redirected money to cover his legal fees. Randolph took a slow breath and leaned back against her chair, absorbing the pattern with the weight of someone tracing a long-buried fault line in the earth. The courtroom had once been a theater of procedure. Now it revealed itself as the epicenter of a vast silent accord. Officer, prosecutor, benefactor, all actors in a drama of mutual preservation. She thought of Barrett's smirk, the same smug expression he wore when he thought he was above reproach. Now she saw that smirk as part of a contract written in shadows. Morales produced a printed email chain, its subject line mundane case closure confirmation. He handed it to Randolph. She scanned the messages, Brooks exchanging pleasantries with Barrett's union representative, then forwarding a court order with the causal note filed for today's docket. The dates matched precisely with transfers flagged by Carter. It wasn't coincidence, it was choreography. "Look at the tone," Carter said quietly. "It's friendly, almost casual." Randolph's gaze hardened. "Collusion doesn't always wear contempt," she said. "Sometimes it wears courtesy." She pictured Brooks in the courtroom, her posture respectful, her voice measured, yet behind every measured phrase lay the machinery of concealment. Carter minimized the email viewer and brought up a folder labeled PBF Disbursements. The spreadsheet unfurled in a cascade of figures contributions, earmarked for scholarship programs, holiday drives, youth mentorship, until in fine print, certain sums redirected to a legal assistance fund. Randolph noted the irony, a benevolent facade masking a defense mechanism for power. "These are community donations," Morales said, people expecting help for those in need. Instead, they're underwriting brutality. Randolph tapped her pen against her lip, thinking of the families who'd donated in good faith. She remembered the clergyman who'd approached her after a youth sentencing, praising the department for its generosity in giving city kids basketballs and school supplies. He didn't know that the same hands that tossed jerseys to children had also swept away complaints of violence. Her heart pounded with righteous anger. "We need every signature," she said. "Bank records, meeting minutes, emails, anything that links Brooks Barrett and the Benevolent Fund." Morales and Carter exchanged a glance and dove back into their work, fingers flying over keyboards. The room hummed with focused energy. Each revelation felt like digging through layers of varnish to expose the rotten wood beneath. Randolph watched the rhythm of their collaboration, the way Carter's eyes lit when she found a new connection, the way Morales leaned in to trace a transaction's path. In that dynamic, she saw hope, proof that power, when met with perseverance, could be dismantled. After an hour, Carter lifted her head. "There's more," she said, voice tight. "A memo from 2020. Brooks thanked the PBF board for their continued support. And tucked beneath is a note, funds allocated to cover any future legal expenses for Officer Barrett. She signed it herself. Randolph's breath caught. A handwritten endorsement, not a corporate letterhead, a personal pledge of allegiance. During her years in the prosecutor's office, she'd seen plenty of cozy handshakes and undisclosed understandings, but this crossed a line from quiet complicity to active conspiracy. "We must confront Brooks," she said, steeling herself for the inevitable tension. "But first let's prepare the evidence binder. I want to present everything to the state ethics board by day's end." Morales nodded. "I'll assemble the financial timelines and label each incident summary." Carter gathered the transcripts and emails. Randolph stood smoothing the front of her jacket as though donning armor. She imagined the upcoming hearing, a packed room of state officials and journalists, each eager for clarity. She wondered how Brooks would look when the network of secrets unfurled like a banner in full view. Would she maintain her calm? Would her eyes betray guilt? Randolph felt a flash of anticipation tempered by solemn duty. She crossed to the window and gazed down at the courthouse steps below. A group of reporters congregated, their shiny microphones pointed skyward like stakes in the ground. Community leaders clustered near the entrance arms crossed, waiting for news. The city had awakened to the promise of transparency, and soon all eyes would turn upward. Returning to her desk, Randolph tapped her phone. "Please schedule a meeting with the ethics board and the solicitor's office for 4 o'clock, she said, voice firm. "And alert the DOJ liaison that we have compelling evidence of coordinated misconduct." Her assistant's affirming click echoed through the line. She hung up and took her seat, feeling the weight of the morning's labor settle into her bones. As the sun climbed higher, Carter and Morales filed in with their updated binder. The crack of the spine opening seemed loud in the quiet room. Randolph flipped through the pages, statutes, transcripts, bank ledgers, handwritten memos. Each document was a drumbeat in a symphony of revelation. She paused on Brooks' signature, the flourish under her name as self-assured as Barrett's archived salute. It was a mark of betrayal that she intended to reverberate through every corner of the justice system. "Let's confirm our sources," Randolph said, pointing to the financial records. "I want sworn affidavits where possible so there's no question of hearsay, and locate any PBF meeting minutes from 2018 on. If Brooks was thanking them in 2020, there must be a trail back to when the arrangement began." Carter tapped her tablet. "I've already contacted the fund's administrator. They're retrieving minutes from board meetings. It might take a day or two, but we should have them soon." Morales added, "I'll prepare witness outreach, former PBF members, finance officers, anybody who can attest to these transfers." Randolph nodded, satisfied that the momentum wouldn't stall. She set the binder aside and stood, stretching her shoulders. "We have the skeleton. Now we'll add the flesh of testimony. This isn't just about Barrett's slap anymore. It's about the entire ecosystem that let it flourish." In the next hour, they drafted subpoenas, sketched a public statement, and refined their talking points for the ethics board. The synergy in the room felt profound, a confluence of legal authority, investigative rigor, and moral purpose. Randolph looked at her collaborators, pride and gratitude mingling in her gaze. "Thank you," she said simply. "This is how justice becomes real." By mid-afternoon, as the sun outside dipped toward its zenith, Randolph prepared for the first official confrontation. She gathered the binder, her glasses, and a fresh legal pad. The corridor outside thrummed with expectation as she stepped into the hallway, agents flanking her like lieutenants in a high-stakes campaign. Their footsteps resonated off the marble, a cadence of resolve. Ahead lay a boardroom where ADA Brooks would await her summons. Randolph's heart held no malice, only an unyielding commitment to truth. She recalled why she became a judge: to safeguard the innocent, to illuminate injustice, and to hold accountable those who wielded power without principle. Today she fulfilled that calling. As the doors swung open to the ethics board's anteroom, Randolph felt the gravity of the moment. The network of collusion would no longer thrive in shadows. The city of Charleston, from its dignified steeples to its bustling streets, would bear witness. And in the hush before the storm of questions, Judge Aisha Randolph knew that every betrayal they unearthed would echo with the promise of a system reborn. The courtroom gallery hummed with restrained energy as Judge Randolph took her seat behind the bench, a slender figure in tailored black bunting, the holiday hush of institutional formality. Earlier that morning, the district attorney's office had filed a motion urging her recusal from all proceedings related to Sergeant Barrett's assault investigation. Their argument was clinical and procedural. As a victim, Randolph's impartiality could be reasonably questioned. It was a motion she had anticipated, one designed to push her out of the spotlight and back behind the curtains of etiquette and tradition. But Randolph would not disappear. She had spent her career battling unseen biases, and she understood the power of presence. When the DA's representative rose, a lean man in a charcoal suit, briefcase in hand, to present the motion, Randolph watched him closely. His voice, measured and courteous, outlined the statutory playground of recusal, citing precedents that tended to favor withdrawal under such circumstances. He paused, lifted a sheaf of papers, and offered Randolph what he surely believed was a gracious nod. Instead of accepting, Randolph leaned forward, her silver-streaked hair catching the light like a halo of resolve. The hush in the gallery deepened. Reporters lowered their notepads, attorneys stilled in mid-shuffle, and jurors gathered as observers leaned forward in shared anticipation of her response. When Randolph spoke, her voice carried the authoritative calm that had transformed a courtroom slap into a rallying point for justice. "I am indeed a victim of criminal assault," she began, eyes sweeping the room until they settled on the DA. "But precedent is not destiny. Recusal is a mechanism to preserve fairness when a judge's personal interest might cloud her judgment. Today, however, my interest is not in presiding over Sergeant Barrett's case. It is in ensuring that this courthouse and this community witness full accountability. To retreat now would be to allow procedural courtesy to eclipse substantive justice." Her words landed like a clarion call. The DA's representative opened his mouth, but Randolph continued without breaking stride. I refuse to vanish behind technicalities that serve only to protect what remains of a system built on deference to privilege. A slap may seem a personal wrong, yet it is a window into systemic betrayal. My presence in this case does not imperil fairness. It guarantees it. A murmur rippled through the courtroom the precise moment when spectators sensed that ritual had given way to revelation. Randolph's clerks exchanged surprised glances. Reporters hastily scribbled corrections, and the bailiff stood motionless, baton at his side, equal parts guardian and witness. Even Barrett, seated among the partially detained officers and his defense team, watched in stunned silence as the judge, who was once defined by decorum, now commanded the room with righteous defiance. Randolph tapped a stack of documents before her transcripts of ADA. Brooks's collusive memos. Financial ledgers mapping the beneath-the-surface benefactions, witness affidavits detailing deleted body cam footage. She lifted them with poised authority, as though elevating each page into public view. My decision is not to cling to power, she said, voice unwavering, but to redirect scrutiny toward institutions that have long shielded wrongdoing. Therefore, I will step aside only to ensure Sergeant Barrett's case is transferred to federal oversight beyond the reach of local entanglements. The DA's representative recovered his composure and rose to object, but Randolph raised a hand that silenced him instantly. She had anticipated this moment of procedural pushback and met it with preternatural calm. The gallery leaned in as if the very air conspired to record every syllable. Randolph allowed a beat before continuing. This motion is granted not to excuse me from duty, but to elevate the integrity of this process. Federal oversight will bring the transparency this case demands because justice administered in shadow is justice denied. At that, Randolph signaled to the bailiff, who opened the courtroom doors. Cameras clicked and whirred, flashbulbs punctuating the judge's departure from the bench. Reporters surged forward, their questions ricocheting off the wood-paneled walls. Judge Randolph, why will you not preside? Is this a threat to judicial tradition? Do you fear local bias? But Randolph walked through the clustered attorneys and journalists with measured strides. A living testament to the conviction that accountability transcends comfort. Once outside, Randolph ascended the courthouse steps beneath a sky streaked with the pale gold of afternoon sun. A phalanx of cameras and microphones surrounded her. City Hall journalists elbowed for the best vantage, while local activists held signs reading, "Justice isn't optional, and we see you, Judge Randolph." The murmurs rose to a crescendo as Randolph reached the topmost step and turned to face the crowd. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply stand bareheaded in her charcoal suit, the breeze catching her silver hair like a banner. She glanced at her team, Agent Carter and Agent Morales Trust etched on their faces as they arranged microphones on a portable podium she had requisitioned for this occasion. She caught Carter's eye and gave a slight nod. It was time. Clearing her throat, Randolph's voice rang out across the plaza like the tolling of a great bell. Today I have elected to recuse myself not out of reluctance, but out of necessity. This case will proceed under federal supervision to prevent any further erosion of trust. Yet let us be clear, a slap in a courtroom is not the true crime. The real offense is the culture that permits unchecked power, a culture that turned a public office into a cloak of impunity. Her words echoed against granite columns and rippled across the assembled rows of microphones. Passers-by stopped, commuters, tourists, families drawn by the cadence of her speech. Randolph's gaze swept over them, absorbing the faces that mirrored the city's hopes and frustrations. When people hear of brutality, they expect statutes to stand guard. Instead, too often they find routes to bypass evidence corridors where collusion flourishes. Today, those corridors end. She lifted a printed statement in her hand, an executive summary of the Internal Affairs dossier. This document lays bare the network of complicity officers, prosecutors, administrators, all entwined in a pact of silence. We will send this to federal investigators and to every news outlet willing to publish it, because light is the only disinfectant powerful enough to cleanse the system. A reporter shouted, "Will you return as judge?" After this, Randolph met the question with a steady smile. "I will return when genuine reform has been certified. Until then, this courtroom will belong to the people it serves under the full scrutiny of the law at every level." The crowd erupted in applause, a rolling thunder of affirmation that reverberated down the steps. Randolph waited until the noise subsided, then concluded, "Let today be remembered not as an episode of individual wrongdoing, but as the moment Charleston chose transparency over secrecy, public accountability over backroom deals. Let us see in this slap not merely an act of violence, but a reflection of deeper fractures. And let us rebuild not by returning to business as usual, but by forging a justice that roars rather than whispers its principles." With those final words, Randolph stepped back from the podium, her mission clear. Federal oversight, community engagement, systemic reform, each a pillar of the structure she was helping to rebuild. The cameras snapped, the microphones captured her echo, and the city felt the tremor of possibility. As she descended the steps flanked by her team, Randolph embodied the promise that when authority collides with accountability, the true weight of justice will always fall on the side of courage. The morning sun had barely crested Charleston's rooftops when Judge Aisha Randolph's phone buzzed with its first anonymous warning. The message was chilling in its brevity. "Stay in your lane. No signature, no plea, just 5 words that dripped with menace." Her pulse quickened, but only for a moment. She stared at the text as if sizing up an adversary, then set the phone face down on her desk, determination eclipsing dread. Moments later, an unmarked manila envelope arrived via courthouse mail. Inside lay a photograph of her 9-year-old nephew Lucas riding his bicycle home from school 2 days earlier. His jovial grin now seemed tentative, as though he knew the world carried dangers only adults understood. On the back scrawled in jagged block letters, "Remind me to stop you." Randolph let the photo slip from her fingers and flutter to the oak floor, the weight of the threat settling around her heart. She inhaled steadily, recalling every oath she had ever taken to do no wrong, to protect and uphold the Constitution, to ensure equal justice under law. Threats to her family were designed to break her resolve, but for Aisha Randolph, they only served to steel it. Her gaze moved to the stack of federal liaison reports on her desk, then to the sealed warrant signed by the U.S. Attorney's Office. The next step had become inevitable. By 10:30, U.S. Marshals were assembling in the courthouse foyer. Their black uniforms and polished badges gleamed under the fluorescent lights, a quiet testament to the federal authority ready to intervene where local powers hesitated. Randolph met them in the hallway outside her chambers, flanked by Agent Simone Carter and Agent Diego Morales. The Marshal's leader, Deputy Marshal Conrad Hayes, gave a curt nod. "We're ready. Your Honor," he said, voice low but firm. Randolph looked at the warrant in her hand. United States District Court for the District of South Carolina. Case number 25 CR 1082. Arrest warrant for Sergeant Daniel Barrett. Offenses including assault on a federal official, conspiracy, evidence tampering, and perjury. She felt the gravity of each charge like a cold weight in her palm. This was more than a slap. It was an invitation to uproot a network of corruption. She turned to Hayes and nodded. "Proceed." Within the hour, Barrett was apprehended outside the precinct's back entrance. The scene was stark in its simplicity, a sergeant once accustomed to commanding authority, now under the firm grip of federal restraint. He wore his dress blue stars and stripes gleaming over his heart, as if daring the marshals to snatch them away. When they did, he did not resist. His eyes, once so full of unshakable confidence, flickered with uncertainty. Deputy Marshal Hayes read Barrett his rights in clipped professional tones. Barrett's lips pressed into a thin line as handcuffs clicked behind his back. The journey to the federal holding facility felt surreal. The backseat of a black SUV, the whir of tires against pavement, the sense that every mile carried him farther from the cradle of local impunity and closer to accountability. By early afternoon, Barrett sat on the narrow concrete bench of a federal cell, no cushioned chairs, no camaraderie of precinct hallways. The cold light of a barred window carved shadows across his face. He stared at the rough walls stripped of badge and buffer, the echo of the prison door's slam still reverberating in his mind. For the first time, he felt the isolation he had inflicted on others. In the U.S. Attorney's office across town, federal prosecutors unsealed the indictment. The docket listed 4 felony counts: assault on a federal official, obstruction of justice through evidence suppression, conspiracy to subvert due process, and perjury before a grand jury. Each charge corresponded to a facet of Barrett's reign. The slap itself, the missing body cam footage, the collusive emails with ADA Brooks, and the false statements he'd made on multiple occasions to cover his tracks. Randolph Carter and Morales gathered in the federal prosecutor's conference room as the charges were announced. The room pulsed with gravity. Assistant U.S. Attorney Caroline Nguyen slid a copy of the indictment across the table to Randolph. "This is the culmination of your court's actions and our investigation," Nguyen said. "Now the case shifts to federal jurisdiction." She looked at Randolph with respect and relief, an acknowledgement that local courage had catalyzed national authority. Randolph nodded, her posture unbowed. "Thank you," she replied. "This isn't just about Barrett. It's about every person whose plea for justice was muffled, every complaint swept into a drawer, every officer who abused their badge with impunity." Her voice wavered only with the weight of unspoken memories of clients who had never seen closure of families shattered by unchecked force. Meanwhile, outside the federal building, a small crowd had gathered: reporters, civil rights advocates, and ordinary citizens holding signs reading, "Accountability now and no more silence." Randolph stepped onto the steps shortly after Nguyen's briefing, flanked by U.S. Marshals and her internal affairs team. Cameras flashed as she took the podium, and a hush fell over the assembled throng. She addressed them with the same clear resolve she had displayed on the state courthouse steps. Today, the federal justice system has intervened where local systems failed. Sergeant Daniel Barrett is now in custody, facing charges that reflect not only his assault on me, but the broader conspiracy that shielded his misconduct. She paused, letting her words settle into the heart of every witness. This isn't simply the story of a slap. It is the watershed moment when we said enough to corruption cloaked in privilege. The crowd responded with applause, though Randolph's expression remained grave. "We have an obligation to do more than arrest one man," she continued. "We must confront the institutional rot that allowed evidence to vanish, that diverted charitable funds to conceal legal defenses, and that favored solidarity over scrutiny." She looked into the distance, picturing the narrow corridors of the precinct, the press rooms that had celebrated Barrett's heroics, the hushed conversations that had maintained the status quo. Change will not come overnight. But with federal oversight and public vigilance, we will rebuild a system rooted in transparency, not deference. That evening, news outlets across South Carolina and nationwide broadcast the story as the day's top headline. Bar graphs and timelines illustrated the money trail. Expert analysts debated the legal ramifications. Community leaders praised the judge who had dared to defy tradition. In living rooms and cafe tables, conversations sparked about police reform, prosecutorial ethics, and the role of federal authority in local matters. Back in her chambers, Randolph sat alone for a moment, the late-day sun casting slender shadows across her desk. She retrieved the photograph of Lucas from its place on her desk shelf, now faded to a soft gray, and tucked it safely into her notebook. She thought of her nephew's innocence, of the world she hoped to leave him, one where justice was not a luxury, but a guarantee. She pressed the photo to her heart in a silent vow to keep him and every child safe from the abuse of power. Across town, Barrett's cell lay silent, but for the echo of distant footsteps. A guard approached, handing him a meal tray and the embossed pamphlet on federal inmate rights. Barrett's eyes lingered on the title Justice and Redemption. He closed the pamphlet knowing that redemption would be a long road, one he had never before considered necessary. As night fell, Charleston's skyline glowed with electric promise, a city on the cusp of systemic reform. Lawmakers announced hearings to review police oversight. The local bar association launched an ethics inquiry into ADA Brooks's conduct. Community groups organized voter drives to support candidates advocating accountability. The ripple from Randolph's courtroom had swelled into a wave that threatened to reshape the entire state. In her chambers, Randolph rose and walked to the window, gazing at the distant courthouse spires. The challenges ahead were immense: drafting new policies, overseeing compliance, rebuilding public trust. But she felt no hesitation. The phone lay quiet on her desk, now free of threats. Instead, it was poised to connect her to task forces, reform committees, and federal partners. She allowed herself a small, resolute smile. Tomorrow she would return to the bench, this time, not with the gavel as her only tool, but with the knowledge that justice, once awakened, could not be silenced. And somewhere in the city, Sergeant Daniel Barrett would sit in his cell, stripped of his badge, and buffer reckoning with the full measure of his actions. In that convergence of personal accountability and public resolve, Charleston found its tipping point and the promise of a more just tomorrow. Weeks passed since Sergeant Daniel Barrett's federal conviction became the crucible for a sweeping reckoning. The morning news in Charleston was no longer dominated by routine crime reports or celebrity chefs. Instead, headlines chronicled investigations into decades-old cases, resignations at the prosecutor's office, and the suspension of judges once thought immune from scrutiny. The city felt different, as though the foundation of its justice system had shifted, revealing both fractures and possibilities. In her chambers, Judge Aisha Randolph prepared for her final public address. She had declined to run for another term, believing her legacy hinged not on longevity, but on catalyzing change. Behind her desk, the battered oak surface bore the faint scars of her earlier war room sessions, ink-stained, scuffed corners, and a small brass plaque reading "Integrity First." Against the far wall stood a row of statute volumes, now interspersed with reform proposals, federal oversight reports, and candid letters from community leaders. On the windowsill sat a framed photo of her nephew Lucas, smiling carefree on his bicycle, his presence a reminder of her most personal motivation. Her team gathered quietly, Agent Simone Carter still fresh from the finalization of internal affairs actions. Diego Morales, eyes bright with the memory of every buried complaint they'd unearthed, and Caroline Nguyen, the assistant U.S. attorney who had guided Barrett's prosecution. Each held their place with solemn respect as Randolph stood and adjusted the podium microphone. Her reflection momentarily fractured into dozens of shards against the glass behind her. She began without hesitation, the hush in the chamber weighing like the opening of a theater's curtain. When I first stepped into this courtroom, I believed in justice as an ideal, a concept wrought from law books and lofty speeches. I did not fully grasp its fragility until I witnessed how easily it could be bent hidden or even stolen. Her voice carried a quiet power that transcended volume, filling every corner of the room. She paused, letting that truth settle before continuing. Sergeant Barrett's conviction was not the finale of injustice. It was the overture to an orchestration of accountability. Today we see the ripples of that moment, 30 convictions under review, 7 prosecutors and 2 judges placed on leave, and countless families granted the chance to seek closure denied to them in the shadows of bureaucratic indifference. The sight of reporters framing her every gesture, of colleagues nodding in silent affirmation, only reinforced her conviction that justice must be lived, not simply pronounced. She thought of the victims whose names she carried in her notebook, the teenage boy beaten in a stolen body cam segment, the nurse whose complaint vanished, the young laborer whose fractured cheekbone was excused away. Their stories, once silenced, now formed the heartbeat of reform. "I do not claim credit for these changes," she said, casting a measured glance toward Carter and Morales. "They belong to the brave souls who refused to be unwitnessed, the whistleblowers, the diligent investigators, the journalists who refused to let this story be swept under the rug. My role was merely to unlock the door so that truth could enter." Her gaze shifted to Nguyen, whose steady presence in federal court had been instrumental. "To the Department of Justice and the U.S. Marshals who stood with us, I extend profound gratitude. Your intervention ensured that local obstacles could not smother this case. It proved that when local systems falter, higher principles can and must step in." The applause that followed was both respectful and relieved, as if the city exhaled alongside her. Randolph waited for the ripple to subside before continuing, her tone softening. "Yet let us remember, accountability is not confined to indictments and convictions. It lives in everyday decisions, in the way we train officers, in the transparency of prosecutorial conduct, in the empathy we show to those who come before us." She recounted her earlier decision to recuse herself from Barrett's case, an act she described not as absence but as elevation. "By placing this matter under federal oversight, I signaled that no judge, no prosecutor, and no police officer is above the law." That moment was not about asserting personal authority, it was about affirming the supremacy of justice itself. A murmur of agreement rippled through the assembly. Randolph allowed a tender smile at Lucas's photo tucked into her folder, the innocent witness whose very image had been used in an attempt to cow her into silence. "They threatened my family to deter me," she said quietly. But those threats only deepen my resolve. Because we do not protect families by hiding from danger. We protect them by confronting it, by ensuring that when power is wielded, it is wielded responsibly. Her final words drifted through the chamber like the closing notes of a symphony. Justice is not a moment. It is an ongoing reconstruction, brick by brick, reform by reform, conversation by conversation. We have laid the cornerstone with courage, but the walls rise only through sustained effort. May the next generation never be forced to fight in silence. May they inherit a system forged in transparency, tempered by accountability, and dedicated to the promise of equal protection for all. As she stepped away from the podium, the room erupted in standing ovation, a cinematic tableau of unity that would play across screens and newspapers for days. In that moment, Randolph felt the weight of countless eyes upon her, yet she stood calm and poised, the embodiment of the reform she championed. Later that afternoon, as she walked through the courthouse's marbled halls for the last time, staff and visitors paused to offer applause and gratitude. The bailiff Marcus Jones, once her steady sentinel, nodded with tears glistening in his eyes. Clerks, attorneys, and spectators shared stories of how her actions had restored their faith in the law. In each greeting, Randolph sensed that the real work lay ahead, even as this chapter drew to a close. In her chambers, she packed her final boxes, her legal books, her framed photo of Lucas, and the battered oak pen she used to strike the gavel. She lingered at the door, turning back to survey the room where so much transformation had taken root. The walls, if they could speak, would tell tales of perseverance and principle. Judge Aisha Randolph, now free from robes, closed the door behind her with deliberate finality. Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the courthouse steps in amber. Citizens lingered, sharing reflections on how a single slap had catalyzed seismic reform. Some wept quietly, others exchanged hopeful smiles. The marble stairs no longer felt cold, they stood warm with the promise that justice once woken could not be easily silenced. Randolph walked down the steps, each footfall echoing like a heartbeat. She paused at the base, glancing upward at the pillars that framed her journey. In a voice soft enough for only those nearest to hear, she whispered to herself, "We've built something new here. May it endure." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving behind not a void, but a path for others to follow. In the fading light, her silhouette glided toward a future shaped by the clarity of her vision, the courage of her convictions, and the enduring truth that justice is a legacy, not a destination.